Colonel Marcus Thompson had spent 32 years in the United States Army, rising through the ranks with determination and an iron will that had earned him respect from soldiers across multiple continents. At 54 years old, he was known for his commanding presence, his perfectly pressed uniforms, and his ability to maintain discipline in even the most challenging situations. His chest displayed ribbons from 3 different conflicts. His reputation for never backing down from a confrontation had become legendary among his peers. The colonel had arrived in London as part of a joint military exercise between American and British forces. This wasn't his first visit to England, but it was his first official assignment that required regular interaction with members of the British Royal Guard. Thompson had heard stories about these soldiers and their famous ability to remain motionless for hours, but he had always assumed the tales were exaggerated for the benefit of tourists. On this particular autumn morning, Colonel Thompson was scheduled to attend a ceremonial inspection at the Tower of London alongside several other high-ranking officers from both nations. The event was designed to strengthen military relationships and demonstrate the ongoing alliance between the two countries. Thompson took these diplomatic responsibilities seriously, understanding that his behavior would reflect on the entire American military. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of fallen leaves as Thompson made his way through the historic grounds of the tower. His polished boots clicked against the ancient stones, and his uniform was immaculate. Despite the early hour, he had always prided himself on his appearance and bearing, believing that a soldier's external presentation reflected their internal discipline and commitment. As he approached the designated meeting area, Thompson noticed a young British guard standing at attention near the entrance to one of the tower's historic buildings. The soldier appeared to be in his early 20s, with the distinctive red tunic and tall black bearskin hat that had become synonymous with the Royal Guard. His rifle was held at precisely the correct angle, and his eyes stared straight ahead. Without the slightest movement, Thompson paused to observe the guard more closely, curious about the level of discipline required to maintain such perfect stillness. He had trained countless soldiers throughout his career, but he had never encountered the specific type of ceremonial duty that required such rigid motionlessness. The American military focused more on practical combat skills and adaptability rather than this type of traditional pageantry. The colonel noticed that despite the early hour, a small group of tourists had already gathered nearby, taking photographs and whispering among themselves about the guard's impressive stillness. Some visitors were trying various tactics to get the soldier's attention, making faces and waving their hands in front of his face. But the young man remained completely unresponsive. Thompson found himself genuinely impressed by the guard's discipline, but also somewhat skeptical about whether such rigid training served any practical military purpose. In his experience, soldiers needed to be flexible and responsive to changing situations, not locked into ceremonial poses that seemed more suited to museum displays than real military service. As he continued to watch, Thompson began to wonder about the limits of this training. How long could the guard maintain his position? What would it take to break his concentration? The colonel's competitive nature, honed by decades of military challenges and tests of will, began to stir. He had never encountered a soldier he couldn't command or influence in some way, and this motionless figure represented an intriguing challenge. The other officers who were supposed to join Thompson for the ceremonial inspection were running late. Leaving him with unexpected free time to observe the guard more carefully, he circled around the soldier slowly, noting every detail of his posture and equipment. The young man's breathing was so controlled that his chest barely moved, and his eyes never shifted focus even as Thompson moved into his peripheral vision. Thompson had participated in staring contests as a child, had faced down enemy soldiers in combat situations, and had maintained his composure during congressional hearings that could have ended his career. He understood the psychology of mental toughness and the importance of never showing weakness in front of others. But this British guard represented something different, a type of discipline that seemed almost inhuman in its perfection. The colonel began to feel a familiar stirring of competitive spirit, same feeling he had experienced before every major. The challenge of his military career, this wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was becoming a test of wills between two professional soldiers from different traditions and different philosophies of military service. Private William Hayes had been serving in the Coldstream Guards for 18 months, and today marked his first solo ceremonial duty at the Tower of London. The 22-year-old soldier had spent countless hours training for this moment, learning to control every muscle in his body and every thought in his mind. His instructors had prepared him for tourists, for weather conditions, and for the physical demands of standing motionless for extended periods. But nothing had quite prepared him for the intense scrutiny he now felt from the American officer. Hayes could sense Colonel Thompson's presence without moving his eyes or turning his head. Years of training had taught him to be aware of his surroundings while maintaining perfect stillness, and the colonel's commanding aura was impossible to ignore. The American officer wasn't behaving like a typical tourist. There was something more deliberate and challenging about his observation. The guard's training had included psychological preparation for exactly this type of situation. His instructors had taught him that maintaining discipline wasn't just about physical control, but about mental strength and the ability to resist any attempt to break his concentration. Hayes had practiced meditation techniques, breathing exercises, mental focusing methods that allowed him to separate his consciousness from external distractions. Colonel Thompson decided to test the guard's limits in a systematic way. Began by positioning himself directly in front of the soldier, maintaining eye contact with an intensity that had intimidated countless subordinates throughout his career. The colonel's steel-gray eyes had a piercing quality that seemed to look straight through people, and he had used this natural gift to establish dominance in hundreds of military encounters. For several minutes, the two men engaged in what appeared to be a staring contest, though only one of them was participating willingly. Thompson studied every detail of the guard's face, looking for any sign of discomfort, fatigue, or wavering concentration. The young soldier's eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the colonel's shoulder, never making direct eye contact, but never showing any indication that he was even aware of the American's presence. Thompson began to feel a growing sense of frustration that was completely unfamiliar to him. Throughout his military career, he had been accustomed to immediate respect and acknowledgement from other soldiers. His rank and reputation typically commanded instant attention and deference. This British guard seemed completely immune to his authority and presence. The colonel decided to escalate his approach, began walking in circles around the guard, sometimes stopping suddenly to see if the movement would cause any reaction. He moved closer and farther away, testing whether distance affected the soldier's concentration. He even tried standing directly beside the guard and speaking in a low voice, making comments about military discipline and the differences between American and British training methods. Hayes heard every word the colonel spoke, but his training had taught him to process external sounds without allowing them to affect his physical posture or mental focus. The American officer's comments were actually quite respectful and professional, which made it easier for Hayes to maintain his discipline. He had dealt with much more aggressive attempts to break his concentration from tourists and pranksters. As the minutes passed, Thompson's competitive instincts became more pronounced. He had never encountered a soldier who seemed so completely unaffected by his presence and authority. The guard's perfect stillness began to seem less like impressive discipline and more like a personal challenge to the colonel's own reputation and abilities. Thompson decided to try a different approach. He began speaking more loudly, sharing stories about his own military experiences and the challenges he had faced throughout his career. He talked about combat situations where mental toughness had been the difference between life and death, hoping to establish some kind of connection with the young soldier. The colonel's voice carried across the courtyard, attracting attention from passing tourists and even some of the Tower of London's staff. People began to gather at a respectful distance, curious about the interaction between the high-ranking American officer and the motionless British guard. Some visitors pulled out their phones to record what appeared to be an unusual confrontation. Hayes was aware of the growing audience, but his training had prepared him for public attention. What was more challenging was the colonel's obvious frustration and the increasingly personal nature of his comments. The American officer was clearly a dedicated soldier with impressive credentials, and Hayes found himself genuinely interested in the stories being shared. Even though he couldn't respond or acknowledge them in any way, Thompson realized that his behavior was beginning to attract unwanted attention. But his competitive nature wouldn't allow him to simply walk away. This had become more than a casual observation. It was now a test of wills between two professional soldiers, and the colonel had never lost such a contest in his entire career. 20 minutes had passed since Colonel Thompson first approached the guard. Kay and his frustration was beginning to show in ways that surprised even him. The colonel's voice had grown louder and more insistent, and his movements around the guard had become more aggressive and unpredictable. He was no longer simply observing. He was actively trying to break the young soldier's concentration through sheer force of personality and presence. Thompson began to share increasingly personal details about his military career, hoping to find some topic that would resonate with the guard and cause him to break his discipline. He talked about his first deployment, his promotion ceremonies, and even some of his failures and setbacks. The colonel was essentially having a one-sided conversation with someone who couldn't respond. But he continued talking as if the guard might suddenly acknowledge him. The crowd of onlookers had grown significantly, with tourists from around the world gathering to witness what appeared to be an unprecedented confrontation. Many people were recording the interaction on their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something unusual and potentially historic. The Tower of London staff were beginning to look concerned, but they were unsure how to intervene in what appeared to be an interaction between two military professionals. Private Hayes was experiencing the most challenging the test of his training since joining the Coldstream Guards. The colonel's stories were genuinely interesting, and his obvious dedication to military service was admirable. Hayes found himself wanting to respond to some of the questions and comments, particularly when Thompson talked about the similarities and differences between American and British military traditions. The physical demands of maintaining perfect stillness for an extended period were also beginning to take their toll. Hayes had trained for situations like this, but the added psychological pressure of the colonel's intense focus was making the challenge more difficult than usual. His muscles were beginning to ache and he could feel sweat forming under his heavy uniform, but he maintained his position and breathing pattern exactly as he had been taught. Colonel Thompson decided to try a more direct approach. He positioned himself so close to the guard that their faces were only inches apart, and began speaking in the commanding voice he had used to address troops in combat situations. He talked about military honor, duty, and the respect that soldiers owed to senior officers regardless of nationality. "Soldier, I am Colonel Marcus Thompson of the United States Army," he said in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. "I have served my country for over 3 decades, and I am speaking to you as one professional warrior to another. I respect your discipline and your commitment to your duty, but I am requesting that you acknowledge my presence and my rank." The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was happening. Even the casual tourists could tell that this had moved beyond simple curiosity into something more serious and potentially confrontational. Some people began to look uncomfortable, while others leaned in closer, not wanting to miss whatever happened next. Hayes felt the full weight of the colonel's authority and presence, but his training held firm. He had been taught that maintaining discipline during ceremonial duty was not just about personal pride, but about representing centuries of military tradition and the honor of his regiment. Breaking his composure would not only reflect poorly on him personally, but would also dishonor the thousands of guards who had maintained these standards before him. Thompson's competitive instincts were now completely engaged. This was no longer about curiosity or cultural exchange. It had become a direct challenge to his authority and reputation. He had commanded respect from generals and world leaders, had negotiated with enemy commanders, and had maintained discipline in life or death situations. The idea that a young British guard could remain completely unaffected by his presence was becoming intolerable. The colonel began to pace back and forth in front of the guard, his movements becoming more agitated and his voice rising with each statement. He started to question the practical value of ceremonial duties, suggesting that real soldiers should be focused on combat readiness rather than tourist entertainment. His comments were becoming more critical and less respectful with each passing minute. Some members of the crowd began to exchange worried glances, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond what anyone had expected. A few people started to move away, uncomfortable with the tension that was building between the two soldiers. Others remained fascinated by what appeared to be a clash between two very different military traditions and philosophies. Hayes could sense the changing mood of the crowd and the increasing agitation in the colonel's voice. He knew that his continued silence was frustrating the American officer. But he also understood that breaking his discipline now would validate every criticism Thompson had made about ceremonial duties and British military traditions. After 35 minutes of increasingly intense interaction, Colonel Thompson's professional composure finally began to crack in a way that shocked everyone present, including himself. His face had turned red with frustration, and his voice had risen to a level that echoed off the ancient stone walls of the Tower of London. The colonel, who had built his entire career on maintaining control and command presence, was losing both in front of dozens of witnesses and countless recording devices. "This is ridiculous," Thompson shouted, his voice carrying a tone of desperation that was completely unfamiliar to him. "I am a decorated officer of the United States military. I have commanded thousands of soldiers and fought in 3 different conflicts. How can you just stand there and ignore me like I don't exist?" The crowd had grown to over 100 people, and many of them were now openly filming the unprecedented breakdown they were witnessing. Social media notifications were already beginning to buzz as videos of the confrontation started spreading across various platforms. The hashtag Colonel vs. Guard would later trend worldwide. But at this moment, Thompson was completely unaware of the viral spectacle he was creating. Private Hayes remained perfectly motionless. But internally, he was struggling with conflicting emotions. His respect for the colonel's obvious dedication and service record made him genuinely uncomfortable with the situation. Hayes could see that Thompson was a good soldier who was simply frustrated by an unfamiliar cultural and military tradition. The guard wanted to somehow communicate his respect while still maintaining his duty. But his training left no room for compromise. Thompson began to pace frantically in front of the guard, gesticulating wildly as he spoke. His normally perfect uniform was beginning to show signs of perspiration, and his carefully maintained military bearing was dissolving into something that resembled a tantrum more than a professional interaction. The colonel was experiencing something he had never faced before, a complete inability to influence or control a situation through his usual methods. "I don't understand what kind of training produces this," Thompson continued, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "The American military, we teach our soldiers to be responsive, adaptable, and respectful to senior officers. How is standing like a statue supposed to serve any military purpose? What happens if there's an emergency? What happens if someone needs help?" The questions were actually quite insightful and reflected legitimate differences in military philosophy between the two nations. Thompson's frustration wasn't entirely unreasonable. He was encountering a tradition that seemed completely foreign to his understanding of military service and discipline. However, his method of expressing these concerns was becoming increasingly inappropriate and unprofessional. Several Tower of London staff members had gathered nearby, discussing in hushed tones whether they should intervene in the situation. They were reluctant to interfere with what appeared to be a military matter, but they were also concerned about the growing crowd and the potential for the situation to escalate further. The staff had never encountered anything quite like this. During their years of working at the historic site, Hayes was approaching the physical and mental limits of his endurance. The combination of maintaining perfect stillness for an extended period while dealing with the psychological pressure of the colonel's intense focus was more challenging than anything he had experienced during training. His muscles were cramping. His uniform felt unbearably heavy, and sweat was running down his back, despite the cool autumn air. Colonel Thompson suddenly stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the guard, his face only inches away from Hayes's unmoving features. The colonel's eyes were wild with frustration, and his breathing was heavy and irregular. This was a man who had always prided himself on his self-control and professional demeanor, and he was now displaying neither quality. "Look at me, Thompson," shouted, his voice echoing across the courtyard and causing several tourists to step back in alarm. "I am talking to you. I am a human being, and I deserve basic respect and acknowledgement. How can you just stand there like you're made of stone? How can you ignore another soldier who is trying to communicate with you?" The desperation in the colonel's voice was unmistakable, and many people in the crowd began to feel genuinely uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Some tourists started to leave, sensing that they were intruding on something that had become too personal and painful to watch. Others remained, fascinated by the complete breakdown of a high-ranking military officer who had apparently never encountered a situation he couldn't control. Hayes felt a deep sadness for the colonel's obvious distress, but he also understood that breaking his discipline at this point would only make the situation worse. The guard's training had prepared him for many challenges, but it had never addressed how to handle a situation where maintaining discipline might actually be causing genuine pain to another person. Just as Colonel Thompson appeared to be reaching his breaking point completely, a calm but authoritative voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "Colonel Thompson, I believe you're needed for the inspection briefing." The speaker was General Patricia Morrison, Thompson's immediate superior and the commanding officer of the American delegation to London. She had arrived to find her subordinate in the middle of what appeared to be a very public meltdown in front of one of Britain's most famous tourist attractions. The general's expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes conveyed a mixture of concern and disappointment that hit Thompson like a physical blow. General Morrison was a woman who had earned her position through decades of exemplary service and unshakable professionalism. She was known for her ability to handle difficult situations with grace and diplomacy, qualities that had made her the perfect choice to lead joint military exercises with allied nations. Seeing one of her officers behaving in such an unprofessional manner was both embarrassing and deeply troubling. The crowd, which had been watching the confrontation with fascination and growing discomfort, suddenly became aware that they were witnessing something that had serious professional consequences. The presence of another high-ranking American officer transformed the situation from an entertaining spectacle into a genuine military incident that would likely have lasting repercussions. Colonel Thompson turned to face General Morrison, and the reality of his situation hit him with devastating clarity. His face, which had been red with frustration and exertion, suddenly turned pale as he realized how completely he had lost control of himself in the situation. The colonel, who had prided himself on never showing weakness, had just displayed the most unprofessional behavior of his entire career in front of hundreds of witnesses. General Morrison Thompson said, his voice now barely above a whisper, I was observing the ceremonial procedures," and his words trailed off as he realized there was no way to explain or justify what had just happened. Videos that dozens of people had recorded would speak for themselves, and no amount of explanation could undo the damage to his reputation and career. Private Hayes, who had maintained his perfect stillness throughout the entire confrontation, felt a wave of relief at the general's arrival. The psychological pressure that had been building for nearly an hour suddenly began to ease, though he knew he had to maintain his position until his scheduled relief arrived. The guard had successfully endured one of the most challenging tests of his training, but he took no pleasure in the colonel's obvious distress. General Morrison addressed the crowd with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing public relations in difficult situations. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. This has been an unofficial cultural exchange between our military services, and we appreciate your understanding as we conclude our observations." Her words were carefully chosen to minimize the incident while acknowledging the crowd's presence. The general's diplomatic language couldn't completely disguise what had happened, but it provided a framework for people to interpret the events in a less damaging way. Some tourists began to disperse while others continued filming. Recognizing that they had witnessed something unprecedented, Thompson stood beside his superior officer, his earlier aggression and frustration replaced by a crushing sense of shame and professional failure. He had spent 3 decades building a reputation for leadership and composure, and he had destroyed much of that legacy in less than an hour. The colonel understood that this incident would follow him for the rest of his military career and beyond, The general placed a firm but supportive hand on Thompson's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed both authority and concern for a fellow officer who had clearly lost his way. "Colonel, I think we should discuss this privately," she said in a voice that was quiet but carried unmistakable authority, as the two American officers prepared to leave. Thompson turned back toward Private Hayes one final time. The guard remained in perfect position, his eyes still fixed on the distant point he had been trained to focus on. For the first time since the confrontation began, Thompson seemed to truly see the young soldier as a person rather than an obstacle to his authority. "Soldier Thompson," said, his voice now filled with respect rather than frustration, "I apologize for my behavior. You have demonstrated exactly the kind of discipline and professionalism that every military service should be proud of. I hope you can forgive an old soldier who forgot his manners." Hayes heard every word of the apology. Though he couldn't respond or acknowledge it directly, he felt a genuine appreciation for the colonel's willingness to take responsibility for his actions. The guard understood that Thompson was a soldier who had simply been overwhelmed by an unfamiliar situation and his own competitive nature. 6 months after the incident at the Tower of London, Colonel Marcus Thompson sat in his office at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, reviewing the letter that had arrived in the morning mail. The envelope bore the official seal of the British Ministry of Defense, and inside was an invitation that he had never expected to receive. Private William Hayes, now promoted to Lance Corporal, was requesting permission to visit American military training facilities as part of a cultural exchange program. The aftermath of Thompson's public breakdown had been as challenging as he had anticipated. The videos had indeed gone viral, accumulating millions of views and generating countless memes and commentary about military discipline, cultural differences, and the importance of maintaining professional composure. Thompson had faced a formal reprimand, mandatory anger management counseling, and the quiet but unmistakable disappointment of his peers and superiors. However, the incident had also led to unexpected opportunities for reflection and growth. Thompson had spent months examining his own assumptions about military service, leadership, and the ways that different cultures approach discipline and tradition. He had come to understand that his confrontation with Hayes had revealed more about his own limitations than about any flaws in British military training. The colonel had used his experience as a teaching tool, speaking to junior officers about the importance of cultural sensitivity, emotional regulation, and the dangers of allowing competitive instincts to override professional judgment. His willingness to discuss his mistakes openly had actually enhanced his reputation in some circles, where his honesty about failure was seen as a mark of genuine leadership. Lance Corporal Hayes had also been profoundly affected by the encounter. His successful maintenance of discipline under extreme pressure had earned him recognition within the Coldstream Guards and had led to his promotion and selection for the cultural exchange program. However, Hayes had found himself thinking often about Colonel Thompson's obvious distress and the personal cost of his own unwavering discipline. The young soldier had realized that while his training had prepared him to resist external pressure, it had not taught him how to balance duty with compassion for others who might not understand or appreciate his traditions. Hayes had requested the exchange program specifically to learn more about American military culture, to find ways to bridge the gap between different approaches to military service. When Hayes arrived at Fort Bragg 3 weeks later, the reunion between the two soldiers was both awkward and deeply meaningful. Thompson had arranged for Hayes to observe American training methods, participate in field exercises, and experience the more flexible and adaptive approach that characterized much of U.S. military culture. The two men spent hours discussing their different backgrounds, training experiences, and philosophies of military service. Thompson learned about the historical significance of ceremonial duties and the way that traditions like the changing of the guard connected modern soldiers to centuries of military heritage. Hayes gained appreciation for the American emphasis on adaptability, individual initiative, practical problem-solving skills. Their conversations were often serious and reflective, but they were also marked by genuine friendship and mutual respect. Both soldiers had learned important lessons from their confrontation, and they found that their different perspectives complemented each other in unexpected ways. Thompson's experience and leadership abilities, combined with Hayes's discipline and cultural awareness to create a partnership that benefited both of their military services. The exchange program was so successful that it was expanded to include other soldiers from both nations. Thompson and Hayes became unofficial ambassadors for military cultural exchange, speaking at conferences and training events about the importance of understanding and respecting different military traditions while finding common ground in shared values of service and dedication. Years later, when Thompson reached mandatory retirement age, Hayes traveled to North Carolina to attend the colonel's retirement ceremony. The British soldier stood at attention as Thompson received his final honors. Observers noted the obvious respect and affection between the two men who had once been locked in such an intense confrontation. In his retirement speech, Thompson spoke about the lessons he had learned from a young British guard who had taught him that true strength sometimes meant standing perfectly still while others lost their composure. Hayes, now a sergeant major in the Coldstream Guards, had often told his own soldiers about an American colonel who had shown him that admitting mistakes and learning from failure were marks of genuine leadership. Their story became a case study. In military academies on both sides of the Atlantic, used to teach future officers about cultural sensitivity, emotional regulation, and the importance of finding strength in apparent weakness. The viral videos that had once seemed like career-ending embarrassments had become valuable teaching tools that helped thousands of soldiers better understand the complexities of international military cooperation and personal growth through adversity.